I had never either seen anyone on his knees, nor had I ever myself prayed on my knees, confesses Mr. Muller. Up till this time, his life had been one with little prayer in it. He had not learned the glory that comes from asking God for life's blessings. When he saw a man on his knees, the entire course of his career was changed. He found at last the things for which sinful youth, when driven by religious impulses, had quested. One Saturday afternoon, about the middle of November, 1825, when George was 20, he and Beta took a walk in the open fields. On returning, Beta asked George to attend a cottage meeting with him, which he had been in the habit of attending each Saturday evening at the home of a Christian. Quote, "And what do they do at this meeting?" asked George. "They read the Bible, sing a few hymns, pray, and someone reads a printed sermon." No sooner had I heard this than it was to me as if I had found something after which I had been seeking all my life, says our hero. We went together in the evening. As I did not know the manners of believers and the joy they had in seeing poor sinners caring about the things of God, I made an apology for coming. "Come as often as you please. House and heart are open to you," returned Mr. Wagner, a Christian tradesman in whose house the meeting was held. The group sat down and sang a hymn, which was followed by a prayer offered by one of the brothers present, named KIII, later becoming a missionary to Africa under the London Missionary Society, who called upon God for his blessings to fall on the meeting. That kneeling in prayer made a lasting impression upon Muller. Off their knees, KIII read to the company a chapter from the Bible and then a printed sermon, since it was not lawful for a layman to expound the scriptures in Prussia. When the benedictory hymn had been sung, the believers again went to their knees, to be led this time in prayer by Wagner. I could not pray as well, thought George, as he listened to the tradesman's eloquent pleas, though I am much more learned than this illiterate man. He was truly happy for the first time in his life. If I had been asked why I was happy, I could not have clearly explained it, Muller notes long after he had learned the joy of praying. Homeward bound, George said to his friend Beta, "All we have seen on our journey to Switzerland, and all our former pleasures, are nothing in comparison with this evening." At home again, the young man fell upon his knees. When it came time to sleep, George says, "I lay peaceful and happy in my bed." He had little doubt that God began a work of grace in his heart, a deep sense of joy springing up with scarcely any sorrow or with but little knowledge. The work of divine grace had been done, and henceforth the young man is to walk the path of the just, which shines with ever-increasing brightness until it ends in the perfect day. He was a changed life. He read the scriptures and not the classics, as formerly, praying often and attending church as prompted by divine love within. At the university, he stood on the side of Christ and gladly paid the price of being laughed at by his fellow students for his religious fervor. In January of 1826, he was moved by spiritual ardor to become a missionary through reading missionary papers and by meeting Hermann Ball, a learned and wealthy young man who worked in Poland among the Jews as a missionary. "I truly began to enjoy," says Mr. Muller, "the peace of God which passes all understanding." And off went a letter to Father and Mother Muller, entreating them to seek the Lord, for they too could be as happy as he. But an angry letter was their answer, for his father desired that he should stop all this nonsense and get to work making out himself an accepted minister, a clergyman with a good living, who would be able to support his parents in their old age. At the same time, the famous Dr. Tholuck took to the chair of divinity at the university, and this godly man drew pious students to him. From the professor, George received a strengthening influence. At once he determined to be free from his parents, to receive normal money from them, and to trust solely in the Lord for his needs. God was not long in supplying the temporal needs of his trusting student, for Tholuck shortly recommended him to a group of American professors who did not understand German to teach them the language. "Thus did the Lord richly make up to me the little which I had relinquished for his sake," says Mr. Muller. Though a divinity student, he had not yet preached. His first sermon was a severe trial, for he attempted to carry it through on his own strength. A schoolmaster arranged for him to speak in the parish of an aged clergyman, and on August 27, 1826, he went out and spoke at the morning service, having written and memorized his message. The delivery brought no unusual blessing from the Lord. In the afternoon there was another service at which he could speak more freely than in the morning. It came to my mind to read the 5th chapter of Matthew, and to make such remarks as I was able. Immediately upon beginning to expound, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," I felt myself greatly assisted, and the poor in spirit, and whereas in the morning my sermon had not been simple enough for the people to understand it, I now was listened to with the greatest attention. My own peace and joy were great. This endeavor launched him on a preaching career, which henceforth was to be a simple exposition of the Scriptures. From this course he never deviated throughout his many years as a public servant of the Master. As a divinity student, he fell into the common error of reading books about the Bible, but not reading the Bible itself. I practically preferred for the first 4 years of my divine life the works of uninspired men, he confesses. The consequence was that I remained a babe, both in knowledge and grace. Since the ministers were themselves unenlightened spiritually, there was little in the sermons to feed his soul. Though he regularly went to church when not preaching, yet he scarcely ever heard the truth. He affirms, "For there was no enlightened clergyman in the town." He often walked 10 or 15 miles to hear a godly minister expound the word. The one bright spot in the week was the meeting in Johann Wagner's home, where he had been spiritually awakened. George also attended a Sunday meeting of religious students, which increased from 6 to 20 during the time he was at Hale. He soon took another significant step which brought him into contact with an orphanage work, later to be the model of his own orphanages. For 2 months he lived in the free lodgings furnished for divinity students in the famous orphan houses built by A.H. Franck. More than 100 years earlier, Franck had been led to establish an orphanage in entire dependence upon God. Though Franck had died in 1727, the work continued through faith. This became an inspiration to Muller, and often he records how much he was indebted to the example of trust and prayer which Franck exhibited. In August of the same year, 1827, when George was 22, he heard that the Continental Society in England planned to send a missionary to Bucharest to assist an aged missionary in his work. After much prayer, Mr. Muller offered himself to Dr. Tholuck, and had been requested to find a suited minister for service. Most unexpectedly, writes this fervent soul, my father gave his consent. I prayed with a degree of earnestness concerning my future work, but God intervened, for this was not the divine will for Muller. The war between the Turks and the Russians caused the society to abandon the idea. With the outreaching of his soul, the young minister was seeking the field for his life's investment. While there was a ringing challenge to be a missionary, he was never permitted to serve in this capacity, since God had other plans for his life. He had become interested in the Hebrew language, to which he was devoting much study. On November 17th, he called upon Dr. Tholuck, who, learning of this interest in the young man's life, asked, "Would you like to serve as a missionary to the Jews?" The professor went on to say that he was connected with the London Missionary Society for promoting Christianity among the Jews. I was struck with the question, declares Mr. Muller, and told him what had passed in my mind. A divine miracle with far-reaching results was about to occur in Muller's experience, from which directly sprang his life's work. Oftentimes, God indirectly leads one to the fields of his service, which was to be the case with George. God wanted this youth in England, where his sphere of influence was to be centered. When Tholuck learned that this young student was interested in the Jews, he at once wrote to the London Society suggesting Muller's name as a candidate. In March 1828, the Society answered asking the candidate a number of questions, and on June 13th, a letter came saying that they would take George as a missionary to student. For 6 months on probation. There was one proviso, meaningful and life-determining. He must come to London, for God wanted George Muller's fame to spread throughout the world from this English-speaking nation. Germany had her Frank, and England must also have her Muller, apostle of faith. There was a formidable obstacle. Every Prussian man must serve 3 years in the army, and classical students who had passed the university examinations were forced to serve only 1 year. Muller had not yet received his army training, and without an exemption, he could not obtain a passport to leave the country. His application for exemption was denied, and Muller felt much depressed because of the denial. But God had plans for this exemption. While in Leipzig, with an American professor for whom he was serving as tutor in German, between acts at the opera, George took some iced refreshments, which caused him to become sick. This resulted in a broken blood vessel in his stomach. Being advised by his friends to go to Berlin, he found an open door for preaching to wards in the poorhouse and in the prisons. On February 3, 1829, he was re-examined for the army, and because of his stomach trouble, was declared physically unfit for service, and hence exempted. Immediately he received his passport and set sail for London, where he arrived on March 19th. While waiting for his missionary appointment in London, he heard friends speak of a dentist, a Mr. Groves, who gave up a salary of $7,500 a year to be a missionary to Persia, simply trusting in God for temporal supplies. This made an impression on me, Muller affirms, that I not only marked it down in my journal, but also wrote about it to my German friends. Again, God was gently leading Muller into a life of trust. His old trouble struck again, and for weeks he despaired of his life. I longed exceedingly to depart and be with Christ, he says. O Lord, he prayed while on his sickbed, do with me as seems best, a prayer which was slowly answered, for God permitted his servant to linger in sickness, that his soul might learn a new lesson in trust. A few days later he went to Tynemouth to recuperate. Here the Ebenezer Chapel was reopened, and Mr. Muller had the privilege of living for 10 days with the preacher. It was during this brief stay that God taught him the true meaning of the Bible. God began to show me, he writes, that his word alone is our standard of judgment, that it can be explained only by the Holy Spirit, and that in our day, as well as in former times, he is the teacher of the people. These few days seemed unmeaningful in building Muller's life career until this lesson appears. For the Bible became, from then on, the true source of his inspiration, and the one book to which he was solely devoted, which proved to be a pivot in the upward climb of George's soul. He delineates how he tested the Bible truth by experience. The Lord enabled me to put to the test of my experience by laying aside commentaries in almost every other book and simply reading the Word of God and studying it. The result of this was that the first evening I shut myself into my room to give myself to prayer and meditation over the Scriptures. I learned more in a few hours than I had done during a period of several months previously. He goes on to add, but the particular difference was that I received real strength for my soul in doing so. This brief stay in the country worked the design of God into his spiritual pilgrimage, for henceforth, through meditation upon the Bible and prayer, he was to commit his ways unto the Lord. Near the end of his life, he affirmed that he had read the Bible through approximately 200 times, 100 of which were on his knees. This is the keynote of that marvelous life of trust. He found God's promises in the Bible and experienced the truth of them in his everyday life. He learned to believe what he read and to act accordingly. He mined religious truth not from the books of human fabrication, but from God through divine inspiration in what he read, he lived. God is now ready to thrust Muller forth into his vineyard, a full-fledged apostle of trust. Yet there is another lesson he is to experience before God can use him to the fullest extent. He must learn to tell not man, but God his needs, and to believe God will supply them. Around the bend in his career, this lesson is next in God's book of life for Muller to master.